My last video was on adaptations of existing works that really try to follow the spirit, if not the letter, of their source material. And so today I wanted to maybe do a video that is about the polar opposite end of that, something that really doesn't follow the source very well at all, and in some cases just throws it out the window. So today's Meltdown is about Constantine. No, not that one. Not that one at all. This one. So this movie really kind of has a little bit of a strange history to it, just in that it took 9 years for them to make. I think they initially sold the script for it in 1996, and it wasn't made or released until 2005. I went deep into the commentary track on the DVD and other things to try to figure out why exactly they made some of the choices they did. And it really kind of seems like they flat out say in the commentary that they didn't think that the character would sell if he was not an American. And like, none of the studios they pitched it to even knew what it was, had never heard of the character. Generally, it's assumed that this was something that just originated at Warner Brothers because Warner Brothers owns DC Comics, etc. Therefore, people assume that Constantine and his film rights were already there, so they just kind of went to Warner Brothers and said, hey, let's do this. Apparently, that's not what happened. They had to go through a process because it was not a property that had a clear ownership like that, so they were shopping around to different studios. Eventually it did end up at Warner Brothers, but not because it was a foregone conclusion. It was something that they still had to sell to them, because even the executives at Warner Brothers, they went to him and said, hey, I've written this script for a Constantine movie, and they were like, who's Constantine? So in the process of all of that, they did a lot of rewriting of the character to try to make him something that the studio would greenlight. At that point, I guess they just sort of decided, okay, well, we're gonna, once they cast Keanu Reeves, they just sort of, I feel like, wrote just, this character is Keanu Reeves, but with magic. And that's not really what the character is. I think at that point they just sort of decided, if this character is, if we're going to kind of throw out the basic personality of this character, we can throw out pretty much anything from it, and it doesn't really matter. You know, I watched this movie back when it was in theaters in 2005. And I had, gone and rewatched it again to do this. And then watched the commentary on it. The commentary has their director, the two main writers of the movie who had worked on different versions of the script, and one of the producers, Akiva Goldsman. Akiva Goldsman being the guy who is partially responsible for Batman and Robin, the George Clooney version of Batman. I don't know why they still allow him to work on DC projects after that, but apparently they do, because he's still involved heavily in this stuff. I really just honestly don't understand it, because, yeah. Now, the commentary is interesting in that they have a lot of stuff that they go into detail about in there, but it's stuff that isn't really presented or comes across well in the movie. We don't think we should have to do exposition of what this all is, but we will explain it to you here. But also, we just think that this works better if we don't give exposition and don't have a lot of dialogue that explains things. In some places that works okay. In some places it's just confusing. They have an entire elaborate backstory that they explain at the beginning of the movie about how the Spear of Destiny got where it is and is being found now, that involves how the Vatican secretly hid the Spear of Destiny in this church in Mexico decades ago to make sure that nobody ever found it, but it doesn't really, none of that really comes across in the movie, partially because of the fact that the place that it is found doesn't look like a church. It looks like it's a pile of garbage that a couple of scavengers are looking through, and they find it. The story doesn't, the elaborated story they have doesn't really make an awful lot of sense, because then it is literally the spear is wrapped in a Nazi swastika flag. Why exactly would the Vatican hide it there in that condition with no protection on it in a church that they apparently never checked up on and just sort of assumed things would be fine for an item that is that valuable and powerful? It doesn't really track, but it also doesn't matter. That's one of the things where it's like they are over-explaining in the commentary. In the context of the movie, it just feels like it's, the Spear of Destiny feels like it's following along with the Lord of the Rings, the One Ring trope, where it's just, the spear wants to be found, and it wants to go to this location because evil bad guy stuff. And that works perfectly fine, but their over-explanation is just, I don't know, it's a little weird. I just don't think they needed it. But if that explanation does follow along, it just means, well, the Vatican really dropped the ball, because yeah. And I don't want to pick apart all of the instances of this sort of thing happening within the movie throughout, because it would just make this all incredibly long. But there are just several instances where stuff happens that isn't really explained, because the writers and the director have kind of made a conscious decision to not explain things if they don't feel like it. And that leads to stuff where in a lot of movies there are scenes that happen where you would go, oh, well, this will come into play later. I don't understand what is happening now, but I need to remember this because later on something will happen, and then it'll be like, oh yeah, this is why this. But frequently within this, there's stuff that happens that would be a thing that you would think would have a setup and payoff, and there's setup, but there's no actual payoff of those things. They just are kind of things that you can easily forget and never have to worry about again, because they're not going to come up. And, you know, that really is kind of a sign that this movie was underwritten in some places and really maybe needed a few other passes. One thing I don't really recommend necessarily listening to the commentary on it, partially because of the fact that Akiva Goldsman several times throughout the commentary keeps interrupting to make weird jokes that really have nothing to do with anything and are just that he thinks he's being clever. Like early on he makes like a joke about when they are in the scene right after the very beginning with the Spear of Destiny cold open of it, and they get to introducing John Constantine. They have the scene where he is trying to exorcise a demon from a girl, and Akiva Goldsman makes some kind of weird joke about, oh yeah, she seemed familiar, I must have dated her at some point, because she's acting like, you know, weird because she's possessed and stuff. And it was just sort of this like, you know, women are crazy, LOL, kind of weird sexist bullshit, and I was not a fan of it. So casting on this is actually pretty good, for the most part. Like, I would never in a million years before seeing this movie, back then especially, have thought, you know what, I think the perfect person to cast as this like weird creepy demon dude would be Gavin Rossdale from Bush. That was a weird choice, but it somehow just kind of works. I mean, he's probably not the greatest actor in the world, but for the small part that they've given him, that mostly he doesn't even really have to talk or do anything. He just has to kind of look sort of... It's like he's sort of like fancy greasy. I don't know how else to put it, but that it just works pretty well there. Jimon Hansu as Papa Midnight, he's always good. Like, I mean, like anything I've seen him in, he's good. And he's good here, even though he doesn't have much of a part. Like, he sort of shows up in like 2 scenes, but he plays him. He plays him well. I think this was the first thing that I saw Tilda Swinton in. And that's a really good performance, especially because of the twist that it has toward the end. Peter Stormare as Satan. He's the weirdest Satan that I've ever seen. And it's like a thing where nothing about the way that he's presenting himself and the way that he looks visually is like any other version of Satan that you've ever seen in a movie. And it's sort of like a thing that I think wouldn't work in the context of a lot of other movies that feature Satan as a character. But here he works like he's just like nibbling on the scenery just enough in all of his bits that it's just enough to make it like the slightly over the top that it needs for what's going on. And it's every time I see that whole part and his performances within it, it's just weirdly amusing. Which then brings us over to Shia LaBeouf, who I forget is in this until I'm watching it. And I have heard rumors that he was given a different script for his scenes than other people were, and that's why he tonally just doesn't really make a lot of sense and seems off. But I can't find any confirmation to that. They don't mention it at all in the commentary. They don't really much mention his performance other than a very quick bit where they say Keanu wasn't really sure about this, but then he met him and was like, oh, okay. Which is not much of a endorsement, but whatever. His character annoys me. He's not particularly good. I don't think people should cast him in things. So then the main character, Keanu Reeves, as Constantine. The Constantine character, to me, is not this guy in this movie. I think that Matt Ryan's version of him that they've used in the Constantine TV series and then on Legends of Tomorrow that they've been using for the last several years is not quite perfect, but is much more like Constantine is in my head. This version of Constantine, it works in the context of the movie, but it's not my Constantine. Whatever. Now, weird nitpicky side note. And maybe this is like a Catholic thing, and I'm not Catholic. I was not raised Catholic. I was raised, I guess, I would call it Baptist-ish. But this movie is the only place that I have ever seen someone refer to the different chapters of a Bible book as acts. Like, usually when you hear somebody referring to like a specific section of a passage of the Bible, they'll refer to, like, for instance, the Gospel of John, chapter 3, verse 4, whatever. And I've never, before or since this movie, heard anyone refer to a chapter of a book of the Bible as an act. It was just weird, and I just sort of was thinking, is that like a Catholic thing or something, or do these guys just not really have a lot of, are they not very well versed in actual religion stuff? It probably doesn't matter to anyone but me. Is this a Catholic thing? I guess let me know in the comments, because I really don't know. I think ultimately it's a weird thing. When I saw this movie in 2005, I was just kind of not really 100% on board, just because of how different the character was. I think if you ignore the source material and you just try to view this as its own thing, it's not bad. It has some good performances, mostly. It has some fun, sort of dark atmosphere to it. The CGI in it, some places looks, pretty dated and kind of goofy, but for 2005 wasn't bad. But if you're a big fan of the comic series, it is going to be a little disappointing, because it just is very much not the character that you want to see, because it's just not that guy. It just isn't. One of the weirdest things about that to me is the fact that they very specifically made it a very different character. But the DVD set of this comes with this collection of comics, just short stories of Constantine from the some of the older comics, but it is very definitely and obviously the comic version of the character, who is very different from what they put out. And it just, to me, the fact that they put this thing in there, which just highlights the contrast between the two, was a very weird marketing move. And I don't know why exactly they did that. Anyway, thanks for coming to my meltdown. If you have some movie or topic that you would like me to cover, let me know in the comments. Maybe I'll do that.